Perhaps we should just go back and just look at one or two things again in this passage. There's one piece specifically that I think is important, because it's not clear in the English that we read our Bibles in. It happens right in the beginning. When Abram was 99 years old, the Lord appeared to Abram and said to him, "I am God Almighty. Walk before me and be blameless." For a long time in my own life, I read that command as if the one is dependent on the other. As if the Lord is saying, walk before me, A, and be blameless while you do it, B. But actually, it's at the same time simpler and more complex than that. Because if we read it in the Hebrew that it was written in, the Lord is saying, walk before me and you shall be blameless. Walking before me will make you blameless. If you walk before me, you can be no other than blameless. This is referring back to Noah in Genesis 6, when the Lord is upset about the sinfulness of all the people on earth. He singles out Noah as one who walked before the Lord and was blameless. Abraham is like Noah. Something in the way he lives his life is different to the people around him. Walk before me and be blameless. And I will make my covenant between me and you, and I will make you exceedingly numerous. And as you read through that, you'll pick up the word covenant over and over and over again. In fact, in the whole of the first part of Genesis 17, the word covenant appears 13 times, which tells us it is important to take note of what happens. Even more important is this changing of the name. You will be ancestor to a multitude of nations, verse 4, verse 5. No longer shall your name be Abram, but your name shall be Abraham, for I have made you the ancestor of a multitude of nations. And I will make you exceedingly fruitful, etc., etc. And the Lord does not forget about Sarah. And of course, there's a difference between promising a man that he will be the father of many nations and promising it to a woman, isn't there? And as we know from the story of Abraham, he already has a son by his slave, Hagar. And so the promise made to Sarah is incredibly important. These nations, they won't come from other wives of Abraham. They will come from you. But Sarah is barren. Sarah is 98 years old. And in that time, if a couple could not have children, it was simply assumed that it was the wife's fault, because they didn't have modern medicine. So Sarah's on the outside looking in. And of course, we know from this story slightly later on, while the Lord is making these promises, Sarah is standing on the inside of the tent baking bread, and she has a giggle herself, doesn't she? Because she realizes how absolutely ridiculous this sounds. 98 years old, and I will bear my 99-year-old husband a son. And yet this is the promise of God. And not only the promise, but the Lord gives Abraham a sign. The same he did with Noah. He gave Noah the sign of the rainbow. And for this covenant, he gives Abraham the sign of circumcision. Now, we don't have it in our reading, but it follows on after verse 8, between verse 8 and verse 15. There will be a sign of this covenant that your ancestors will carry. That will be a sign for them and for you that they are chosen by God, that they belong to God, that they are part of this great big lineage. Now, we could stop the story there, and we could just spend time talking about how great this promise is and how lucky we are to be included in the promise of Abraham. Except, of course, we're not really included, are we? We're not Hebrews. We don't live in modern-day Palestine or Iraq or Iran. We don't even look the way Abraham looked. We don't speak his language. We certainly don't eat the diet that he would have ate. We don't even pronounce his name right. He's not Abraham, he's Abraham. And yet here we are, included in the promise. Because Abraham was made the father of many nations, not just his own. God's goodness and God's promise extended to all people through the promise made to Abraham. So important is this promise that when Paul is writing his letter to the Romans, this is Romans 4 if you want to read along, he can't help but spend almost an entire chapter talking about Abraham. But we'll just read a few parts. This is Romans chapter 4. From verse 10. Under what circumstances was it credited? Maybe I should read verse 9 as well. Is this blessedness, blessedness is Paul's word for this bestowing of the covenant upon Abraham. Is this blessedness only for the circumcised or also for the uncircumcised? Paul is dealing with that time in the church where they were saying to uncircumcised Romans and Greeks and heathens and pagans and everyone who wasn't a Hebrew, this promise is also for you. We have been saying that Abraham's faith was credited to him as righteousness. Under what circumstances was it credited? Was it after he was circumcised or before? It was not after, it was before. The Lord doesn't say to Abraham, when you have finished circumcising yourself and everyone in your camp, then this promise comes into effect. The Lord is saying, this promise I make to you, and it is in effect the moment I make it. And the sign will be the sign of circumcision. But the circumcision is not the promise. It's the same we had last week. The water of baptism is not the promise of baptism. The rainbow is not the promise, it's the sign of the promise of God's renewing love and life for the world. And he received, verse 11, circumcision as a sign, a seal of the righteousness that he had by faith while he was still uncircumcised. So then he is the father of all who believe but have not been circumcised, in order that righteousness might be credited to them. And he is then also the father of the circumcised who not only are circumcised, but who also follow in the footsteps of the faith of our father Abraham. It was not through the law that Abraham and his offspring received the promise that he would be heir to the world, but through the righteousness that comes by faith. It's a few words repeated in those few verses. The first is circumcision. We said enough about that. The second is faith. And the third is righteousness. Righteousness is this idea in the Old Testament that the scales balance out. That you are a righteous person is Paul's way and is the Old Testament's way of saying you're a just person. You know justice when you see it. You live your life according to the balance of right and wrong. But what Paul is saying, and what the promise of Genesis 17 is saying, is Abraham did not receive the covenant, the blessing, because he was exceedingly righteous in and of himself. Abraham received it because righteousness was credited to him. There's nothing he did to earn it. There's nothing he did to achieve righteousness. Now, some people simply are more righteous than others. Some people simply are more interested in fairness than others. That's not what Paul is talking about. That's not what Genesis is talking about. This is a different kind of righteousness. God's righteousness. The ultimate justice and wisdom and balance. And this is given to believers. And because we are declared righteous, all the promises of Abraham are bestowed upon us. This righteousness does not come from us. It comes from Christ. Next week, we have communion. And we share in the body and the blood that has credited righteousness to us. There is not one person in the life and in the history of the church who is or who has been righteous by their own merit. The righteousness of believers is the righteousness of Jesus through them, in them, working within them into the world. We are fantastically unrighteous people. We are incredibly unfaithful, unbalanced, not deserving of the righteousness and the faith that seems to be in some way a prerequisite to all these promises. But it is precisely because we are unrighteous and because we cannot gain these things for ourselves that in His crucifixion and His death and His victory over sin, we have received the righteousness of Christ. It is not our own. Whether we live moral lives, whether we are good moral people, whether we are a good example of what Christians are supposed to be for the people in our community, has nothing to do with whether we are declared righteous or not. That comes from God. That was given to Abraham when he still had his nose in the dust. And let's not forget that when Abraham had heard all this, he laughed. And I think the first few times that I read and thought about Abraham laughing, I thought it was some kind of character flaw. It was something in Abraham was not really taking God seriously. But the more I think about it, the more I begin to realize Abraham laughing at the breadth and the depth of God's promise might be the only appropriate response. How else are we supposed to respond to that great, loving promise of God than to fall down flat and press our noses in the dust and laugh at how undeserving we are? Laugh that somehow God has chosen us despite all our faults. It's kind of like telling a 99-year-old couple that they were going to have a son. And of course, he doesn't arrive until a year later when they're a whole year older. Abraham hears this promise. He knows he doesn't deserve it. He knows his wife and she knows him. They know each other's faults. They know how undeserving they are. So when he hears this, he laughs that this great promise might also be his. And so it's not a laugh of incredulity. It's not a laugh that doesn't take God seriously or that makes light of his promises. It's rather the kind of laugh that simply happens when we think about the fact that we are saved. Crucially, and we'll end here, this promise is not for life enhancement. This righteousness is not so that we may have luxury and riches and everything we ever wanted just because we believe in God. This is a promise of eternity and of salvation. And we must guard against that deceitful nature that we read about in the Gospel of Mark, that tries to say all of God's promises, all of God's plans, all of God's kingdom is ultimately only about us and how well we can live our lives, about living your best life. God's promise is so that we may have eternal life. Best life can come after that. You have been declared righteous. I have been declared righteous. We have been declared righteous by the same God who credited it to Abraham and to all of his offspring, of which we are also part. That's our great comfort. And perhaps as we move through the time of Lent, we said last week and the week before, Lent is this process of unpacking our lives and letting go of the things that weigh us down as we walk towards the cross. Perhaps we can put a lot of things down on this road, a lot of luxuries. But perhaps the thing we need to hold on to is this promise. Perhaps the thing we need to hold on to is the one thing that we can do nothing about, the righteousness of Christ given to us. Perhaps if we walk this road of Lent with that in our pockets, then perhaps we can meet Jesus at Easter in Jerusalem and be prepared for what happens in that city. Let's make that our prayer together.
Completes his work in me. Mine are days here as a stranger, pilgrim on a narrow way. One with Christ I will encounter, for his name, but mine is armor for this battle, strong enough to last the war, and he has said he will deliver safely to the golden shore, and mine are keys to Zion city, where beside the King I walk, for there my heart has found its treasure. Christ is mine forevermore. Now, oh my soul, for his love is my reward. Fear is gone and hope is sure. Christ is mine forevermore. Come rejoice now, oh my soul, for his love is my reward. Fear is gone, hope is true. my